Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Pod and the Pendulum, the horror movie podcast covering all the horror movie franchises, one movie and one episode at a time. Before we begin this week's episode, we wanted to wish our condolences to the family and friends of film and genre historian David J. Schall, whose passing away was announced prior to us recording the show. His work, both in print and in the many documentaries he's appeared in, it's been invaluable in preparing these episodes. So we just wanted to offer our condolences. But this week we are back with Boris Karloff's final canon appearance as the monster in a Frankenstein movie. Though it's, not his last time appearing in the series or in the makeup. And we are going to be talking about whether or not Karloff goes out in a blaze of glory with 1939's Son of Frankenstein. Sitting in the co-host chair again today is the co-host of the Movies for Life podcast. His writing appears over at Bloody Disgusting, Manor Valum, among other outlets. He has a series of wonderful Frankenstein articles up in Manor Valum right now, which we've linked to in our first few episodes. Mr. Brian Kuiper. Brian, how are we?
Doing good. Ready to don a big hairy shirt and lumber on into this episode.
Excellent. And joining us again, back co-hosting for the first time in quite a stretch, she runs the film criticism site We Who Walk Here. It's Jessica Scott. Jessica, how are we this afternoon?
I'm good. I am so excited to be back. I've missed y'all and missed talking about movies, so I'm very happy.
And we have missed you a ton. Yeah. We have missed you a ton, but as we've said, your spot's always open. So we are so glad to have you back. We kept the light on for you. All you had to do was slam on that giant knocker door a few times and we would open that up.
Oh, thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. And joining us again, a special returning guest. And honestly, if I remember correctly, I think the last time you've been on our show was election night 2020, when, to distract ourselves, we recorded a commentary for Halloween 4 to take our minds off of the hellscape of the news that night. So it has been 3.5 years. And you were one of our more frequent guests in the first couple years of the show. It is the author of Puppet Master Complete, a franchise history. His writings have appeared on Bloody Disgusting, Wicked Horror, dozens of other outlets, too many to name right here. It would be a 3-hour show just naming all the outlets. Welcome back, Nat Brehmar. How are we today?
I am doing great. It's a joy to be back. It has been that long. It was the Halloween 4 commentary. It was the last time I was on. And it's great to do it again. Thanks for having me.
Way too long, and that falls on me. I should have reached out way sooner, way sooner to have you back on. So thrilled to have you back on, especially to talk Universal Monsters. I feel like this is right in your wheelhouse. So I'm excited to go back to school with both you and Brian right now. So, all right. Brian and I have shared our personal history with Frankenstein, and you can hear that on our first episode where we talk Frankenstein. So I'm really looking forward to hear from both Jess and Nat about their early experiences with Universal Monsters and Frankenstein in general. So Nat, as our special guest, do you mind kicking things off? Where were you, when did you first start watching Universal monster movies, and when did you first fall in love with Frankenstein in particular?
So the Universal monster movies were my first adult horror movies. My dad got me all of the 90s Universal VHS re-releases. He got me all of the main monsters. So I consumed Browning's Dracula, Whale's Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Wolfman, and The Mummy at a very, very early age. And also just, there was a lot of Universal Monsters content in the early 90s. So probably well before I watched the movie, when I was probably like 3, I had Big Frank, which was a play school doll that was like a big doll that was also like the game Operation, where you open him up and like you get the gears turning and you see what's working and he'll be like, I'm alive. And it was a bizarrely popular toy for little kids in the early 90s, and that had to
I've
be...
never heard of this.
I heard him yelling in the castle.
Fix me.
His name's Big Frank.
Fix me.
I said, I'm going to fix you. The talking monster, Big Frank.
I'll fix you, Big Frank. Monster boy fixed. How do you feel now, Frank?
I'm alive.
It's always fun to fix him. A talking monster, Big Frank.
Thank you.
Big Frank talks and his eyes light up. Batteries not included.
Had to be my earliest brush with Frankenstein.
That is amazing. I have never heard of the Big Frank toy before.
Oh,
so you would literally take it apart, like take pieces of it out?
Well, his chest opened up and there were gears that would like turn on its own, and like his heart would, you would press it and it would sound like a heartbeat, and all the tools to tinker with him were kept in his head. I remember that. You open up the flat top, and in lieu of a brain, there's all these tools to like fix his gears and everything.
So there was nothing that said like Abby normal brain inside of it like that at all. The 90s were both like amazing and horrifying. The early 90s in particular, in terms of like what as children we were getting to get exposed to. Like we got some really cool stuff that when you look back on it, you're like, oh, this is why we're so messed up in some ways. It's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like that was maybe the last gasp of maybe Universal monsters being like so ubiquitous in the culture. Like you would see them on like cable TV all the time, or like your local TV stations all the time, on cartoons all the time before they kind of maybe disappeared a little bit.
Yeah, in the 90s, it was nuts. Like I had a Universal Monsters coloring book, Universal Monsters paint by numbers, and then I had the entire setup. They did Burger King Happy Meal toys for these like 50, 60-year-old movies.
It's excellent. And now, God, what was it? Someone had posted like, oh, RoboCop, like I like watching old movies, and that movie's like 30 years old. Like that's considered old. Imagine doing a Happy Meal toy for that. What about now? Like, do you still find yourself like returning to these movies repeatedly? Like, what do you get from them as an adult?
Yeah, I have the whole like Blu-ray set. That was actually one of the best things I've ever like been given. I reviewed that complete set for Wicked Horror, and I revisit the films on Blu-ray all the time, particularly the first 2 Frankensteins, which I think are probably the best, alongside maybe The Wolfman for me, probably the best Universal monster films in general.
Yeah.
And so Whale's Frankenstein, and particular Bride of Frankenstein, which I think is one of the best movies ever made in any genre, I revisit those all the time.
Excellent. Jess, how about yourself?
My first Frankenstein movie was actually Young Frankenstein. And that was my only Frankenstein movie for a really long time. Most of my experience with Universal Monsters growing up was just via cultural osmosis. I didn't grow up watching the movies themselves. I just kind of absorbed, It's Alive and the kind of the visual iconography of the films. My first Universal Monsters movie was probably Dracula in my teens, and most of them I didn't watch until I was an adult. But I vividly remember the first time I watched Bride finally. I had assumed that Elsa Lanchester had the majority of the screen time in the film because it's called Bride of Frankenstein. She's such an iconic figure in pop culture. And then when she's just a blip, in the movie in terms of screen time, I was really shocked, but I was more shocked by how incredible her performance was, and I understood immediately why this was such a shock to the system, like such an iconic moment, like a watershed moment in pop culture. Just her performance and how beautiful the film is, and it's one of my favorite film memories and one of my favorite film performances, just because she's so fantastic, and I understood why she's endured as this, iconic image in culture for so long.
Yeah.
And last night was actually my first watch of Son of Frankenstein.
Oh,
Um,
excellent. Okay.
I was really excited for this one because, as you know, I grew up on Young Frankenstein, and I knew that it was based mostly on Son of Frankenstein. So I was really eager to kind of connect the dots and see what had influenced Mel Brooks and kind of fill in the my pop culture blind spots to see, where we're drawing from. And I was really pleasantly surprised by how much I loved this one. I think this
Yeah.
has my favorite production design of the first three films.
Interesting.
Which
Okay.
I'm sure we will get into later on in the episode. But I was really thrilled to watch this one. But yeah, I've had kind of a backwards relationship with the Universal monsters because, like Nat was talking about, you grow up, especially in the 80s and 90s, they're everywhere, but I didn't actually experience them on their own merits until much later.
Yeah, because I know for me, like my love for these movies was passed on to me by my dad. Like he, if I got two things from my dad, it's like a love of the Three Stooges and a love of like Universal monsters. Like those are the two things I definitely got. So it's always fascinating when persons like experience these movies like secondhand and then come to them. And I'm wondering, like, by the time you saw them as adults, like, did it feel like you had already, like, as you're watching the movies for the first time, did it feel like you were already familiar with them or had already seen them? Or was there anything you mentioned with Bride being surprised by how little she was on screen? Was there anything else that was surprising, or did it feel like nope, like these already have a sense of real familiarity because you had picked up so much through the culture?
No, for the most part, they feel like it's a revelation every time I see a Universal Monsters movie and actually sit and watch the film instead of just, you know, a, a still from Creature from the Black Lagoon that I've seen a million times or parodies that I've seen in pop culture. It's very much a fresh experience where I understand how good these films are and why they had the impact they did. Like it's really cool to me to kind of feel the weight of it. Like, okay, I understand why this became so iconic and why this burrowed its way into people's, like, our collective imaginations. But no, it's always a weird sensation going back and watching movies, like seeing imitators and then going back and watching the original. But I've never watched a Universal Monsters movie and been like, I've seen this. It's always a revelation for me.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Well, let's talk a little bit about how this one got made, because I think this might be like the last one until we get to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, that like there's like a real rich production history behind it. 'Cause I think what we're going to find is by the time we get to like Ghost of Frankenstein, like Universal just starts churning these things out a little bit. I mean, I'm hoping to be pleasantly surprised, but like that seems to be my impression right now. But Brian, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit, and maybe like we could all speak a little bit about what happens to horror movies after Bride of Frankenstein. We kind of hinted at it last week, but they disappear for a few years.
Yeah, well, the couple of things happened. So the Hays Code is becoming stronger during this period. It's actually being enforced starting in 1934. We talked about that with Bride and how they had to work around, sort of slide things past the censors a lot with that movie. And apparently James Whale was going to make Dracula's daughter after that, and it was going to be even crazier than The Bride. So that obviously didn't happen. The Dracula's Daughter that we have is a fascinating film, but it's not a James Whale movie. It's something quite different, much more subdued film. But in 1936, Dracula's Daughter essentially became the last Universal Frankenstein or Universal horror film for a while, because two things happened. The first one was the Laemmles lost the studio. The money issues just got away from them, and they had to sell. So
was there any particular production that did them in? Like, was there any particular movie that you know of that was, or was it just every movie Carl Laemmle Jr., if it wasn't a horror movie, like they were losing money on it?
I don't know if there's a specific one you can pinpoint, because Laemmle Jr. was just bad with money. And we talked about that in our first episode a fair amount. And I think it just all caught up with him. So exactly how it all happened, what the dominoes were, I think it's a long history going all the way back to the moment that Laemmle Sr. gave the studio over to Laemmle Jr., with the exception of All Quiet on the Western Front and the horror films. They were just not having successes. So they were losing much more money than they were bringing in. The other big thing was actually probably a bigger blow, was the British Board of Censors banned any movie with an H certificate. So essentially horror movies were banned by Britain. And so because of that, American studios said, well, without that market, what's the point? And they stopped making horror movies. And if you look, I checked this, if you look 1937 and 1938 for horror movies in Letterboxd, there's nothing from the United States. Literally, there are 2 Disney shorts by Ub Iwerks that are horror themed, and then mostly foreign films, and it's only a handful. So Japan seemed to be the place to be during this period if you were a horror fan. But that was about it. I mean, there just wasn't. It's just kind of a nothing there. So it's just kind of fascinating that it literally brought the crew. I mean, people say now, "Oh, is horror back?" or "Horror's dead?" or whatever all the time, and it's never true. In 1937 and 38, it was true. So,
and Nat, Jess, maybe you could speak to it, maybe not. I don't know. I know what the Hays Code is, but I'm not quite sure what they could actually do, like what they could actually enforce, like what power they had in the third. I know it was very stringently enforced, and from the 30s through the 60s, when like New Hollywood basically said, screw it, we're going to make the movies that we want. And you start seeing films like Easy Rider and Mrs. Robinson that just say eschew the Hays Code completely. But what real power did the Hays Code actually have during this time, where studios are going to say, we're just not going to release anything that could seem objectionable? I withdraw my question.
Well, I mean, the Hays Code was, I mean, you can't show violence, you can't show sex. Mm-hmm. This is the era of husband and wife have to sleep in separate beds.
Sleep in separate beds. You can't flush a toilet.
You can't flush a toilet. All that. I mean, it's like it was their definition of obscenity. Whatever their definition of obscenity was, it got pulled out of your script, or you couldn't make your movie.
Right. But what power did they have? Like, what is the enforcing body here, I guess? Like, even with the MPAA, mm-hmm. like if theaters choose to, like, there's nothing stopping a theater from releasing a movie with an NC-17 rating. Mm-hmm. They just mostly choose not to for fear of repercussions. It's my understanding of it. Yeah. So I guess, like, what level of enforcement do they have, I guess?
Well,
like, that's what I don't understand.
The studios bought into it is essentially what it comes down to, because the studios...
So they decided to collaborate
with them. Because it was a self-censoring situation where it's like, we're going to take care of this ourselves, or the government's going to come in and do it for us. This is essentially what it came down to. And they didn't want that. And so that's how things kind of went down as far as the Hays Code goes in that era.
Got it. Okay. So what ends up putting horror back on the map? Like, after a couple years, why do Universal, Warner Brothers, MGM, why is there a resurgence in horror? Because the Hays Code doesn't go away. What makes them finally say, there's money to shake out of this tree?
The big thing is there was a legendary triple feature in 1938, you see, at the Regina Theater in Los Angeles. So they did a triple of Dracula, Frankenstein, and King Kong, and it did gangbuster business. And so Universal saw that and said, hey, our movies that we released, 10 years ago almost, are making a ton of money. Let's get on that gravy train while we can. And just sort of to dam the torpedoes sort of of mentality, I think. And, if Britain won't take them, then, oh, well, we will sell right at home and we'll do okay. From
what I read, this engagement was so successful that for nearly 5 weeks at this single theater, every showing was sold out. And there would be lines around the block like it was like Jaws in 1975 or Star Wars in 1977 that people would wait to get in. And Lugosi went so far to say that like screening Dracula in 1938 is what resurrected his career, because he essentially didn't work for 2 years. And by 1938, like he is relying on a charity fund that's put together by the Motion Picture Association for like whatever meager sustenance he has. Like he loses his home, and he would say that I owe it all to that little man at the Regina Theater. I was dead and he brought me back to life. And the theater owner is Emil Ullman. But like after this triple bill, it was then toured around the country at other theaters and had similar success to the degree that Universal's like, let's press forward. Although with the new owners, like they're not going to get that same lavish production in the 1940s that I think we had seen with Frankenstein, Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein, Invisible Man. They become more for the kids over the next few years.
There is that feeling to them that they're, hey, we're tapping into the children's market here, is what it feels like.
Is there can anyone, I could not find a reason or any answer to this. I'm curious as to why Universal never returns to Lugosi for Dracula outside of Abbott and Costello meets. Like they do make more Dracula movies, but when they make Dracula's Daughter in 1936, it doesn't focus on Dracula. When they return with Son of Dracula, it's Lon Chaney Jr. stepping into the main role. I'm curious as to, and it's not like Lugosi didn't need work, and it's also not like Universal felt like they didn't always. They felt like they could basically pay him what they wanted to, not what he would be worth in that role. Is there any reason why they never returned to him in that role when it probably would have been very lucrative? Like the first movie was like the 6th highest grossing movie of the year. It was such a massive success. Has anyone ever uncovered why they waited so long for him to return to play that role again?
Here's what I think it comes down to. I think by 1943, which is when Son of Dracula comes out. Okay. Universal absolutely hated his performance in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman as the monster. And I think he was considered box office poison to them by that point. And where Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman was quite popular. So they were trying to find something besides the Wolfman. They were trying to groom Chaney Jr. into being their new Karloff or Lugosi, because Karloff was sort of like, I'm done with you guys. He's ready to go on and do other things.
He's with Val Lewton at this
actually
point,
this
right?
is before Val Lewton. He's actually at Columbia during this point. He's during the early 40s. He makes a series of movies at Columbia, which are pretty much all the same, though they're kind of fun to watch. And so I think he was just kind of like considered persona non grata to them at this point. And you literally have, in 2 years after Son of Dracula and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, you have Boris Karloff killing Bela Lugosi on screen. I mean, it's like the metaphor is not lost on people who are sort of familiar with the decline of Bela Lugosi's career in that era. So,
but even before that, because that's a good decade after Dracula.
Yep.
Like, why not go to that well in 1936 or go to that well in 1939 after his performance as Ygor is so well regarded?
Yeah, I could not tell you.
Okay.
My understanding was the Dracula films, because Dracula is one of the great obsessions and studies of my life, is that I always felt it was an intentional decision not to, because I think they had a little more respect for Lugosi's performance, especially coming from the theater, than Karloff's performance, so that they were comfortable churning out movies with the monster, but not as comfortable churning out movies with Dracula himself. I think that was the decision to go to like Dracula's daughter and have a more spin-offy kind of approach, to be like, oh, we're not repeating the same movie. Okay. Especially because when we made that movie, we made it twice. So we're not repeating that again. We're telling, a new story and kind of keeping a sense of reverence for at least a little while for that character and that performance. Right. Has always kind of been my understanding of it.
That's so fascinating, because we talked about this in our Frankenstein episode. By the time Whale makes Frankenstein, like 6 months after Dracula's release, it feels like it's so far ahead of what Todd Browning did. And then you get to Bride of Frankenstein, and it's leap years ahead of Frankenstein, that there's this reverence for that movie. And Lugosi's performance is wonderful. Like, don't get me wrong, like, it's a wonderful performance, but that you would find like that the untouchable movie, where Karloff is still not getting his just due, even though they're churning Karloff pictures out and giving him top billing and starring roles at that point.
Yeah, both of Whale's Frankensteins are, I'm comfortable saying, miles ahead of Browning's Dracula. But I honestly, I think it was just that Dracula was first.
Yeah.
Your Dracula was the pioneer Universal movie.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Nat. So there are some rumors about this possibly being shot in color, maybe not. Brian, you mentioned that there's like some color behind the scenes footage that surfaced, like some test footage.
It's like a minute, and it's on YouTube if you want to, if you've ever seen it. And it's just Karloff in the full costume, and it's in color, and you can, the green and everything. He's sort of sticking his tongue out at the camera. He sneaks up behind Jack Pierce and sort of puts his hands around his neck, and then they have a conversation and shake hands, and they're laughing. And I wish I could hear what they're saying, but there's no sound.
Can you cut the makeup time down to 2 hours?
Right, exactly.
4 hours, man. Really?
Yeah. So, though I think by this time they probably had a pretty good system going, and he's still using the rubber head instead of the collodion built up and cotton head and all that. But I don't know. It doesn't look like Technicolor. It's handheld. And Technicolor cameras were gigantic and heavy, and so there wasn't a lot of hand holding going on with those things. So it's possible that it was like home movie footage, because I looked it up, and there was a color camera, like 16 millimeter for home use camera available at that time. It was invented in 1935, so it would have been a pretty new thing. But we just don't know for sure. But it's an interesting thought. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, considering like the production design of it and everything, and the continuity with the previous era and the low budget nature of these movies, that it would be in color.
It wouldn't look right.
No. And the makeup is very, very green in these pictures. And the impression that I got from different things that I've heard was the makeup for the first two films was more of a blue, green, white sort of, so it would read white on screen rather than
and it's like a pistachio green.
It's very
it looks
green.
Like that kind of light green. So I think there's like his daughter Sandra was born right around this time as well, and I think there are some like photos of Karloff on set. Like they brought he's celebrating her birth. Like they brought him a giant cake. Like he's blowing out candles.
Well, it was his 50th birthday as well. So they were.
And Roland V. Lee, the director, would go on to say like it's where Lugosi and Karloff become friends as well. Like if there had been any animosity between them, because they're I think longstanding stories of Lugosi being maybe a little bit of jealous of Karloff's star rising. And I think you see that in Tim Burton's picture. But I think that is exaggerated. I think so too. Again,
well, here, neither of their children, Bela Lugosi Jr. or Sandra Karloff, say that they heard either of them say anything bad about the other person.
Right.
And, every time that Karloff was asked about Bela Lugosi, he just kind of looked sad and said, "Poor Bela." He really was. It seemed to, feel. I mean, if I don't know if he ever felt like he had any responsibility in his sort of downfall, but.
So I think there are some color photos of like Karloff and the monster makeup, and it's the behind the scenes like birthday footage and celebrating his daughter's birth footage. I don't remember if there's footage of like Sandra on set, like bringing her on set, but Lee would say it was like one of the most fun shoots he ever did. Like there was a lot of laughter on set and it was like really enjoyable for everybody. So
one of the things that's funny about that footage is, he's sticking out his tongue and he's smiling and laughing, in the makeup. And, you just kind of think to yourself, I wish I could hear what they're saying to each other here, because, right.
Scrunts. So Willis Cooper is tapped to write the script, and his original script is a retread of Bride of Frankenstein. It's basically I think they even show like her bones in the beginning of the movie, but the monster still wants a friend and he is still threatening Frankenstein's family. This time it is Wolf von Frankenstein he's threatening, like, make me a friend or else. The monster also is showing off a side of his personality where he's like Dr. Evil. He wants to conquer the world. Like he's becomes more of a mustache twirling villain in this one. Like, so that is very bizarre. The Krog character is much less sympathetic. He's like hounding Wolf von Frankenstein over his father's experience. And instead of an angry mob chasing down Frankenstein's family and the creature this time, the creature would have been chased down by an army. And in the end, Wolf would have stabbed the monster to death before the monster could have performed brain surgery on Peter, Wolf's son. The end. That would have been Cooper's script. So glad that one didn't get made. I think we got a bit of an upgrade. I don't know that there is like an actual script for Son of Frankenstein, because what it sounds like is Rowland V. Lee wrote the script in his head minutes before going to shoot. Like a lot of this movie exists right in his imagination, and then they would go shoot it. And we'll cover that a little bit here. But what, Brian and Nat, what can we talk about the man who was tapped to direct this movie, Mr. Rowland V. Lee?
Do you know much, Nat?
No. No.
Okay.
I can't say I know a lot either. I just have Mike's notes here. That's about it.
Okay. All right.
So
Not a problem. So here's what I've got. He'd worked with Karloff before in The Guilty Generation. And I couldn't quite confirm this, but there is a book called It's Alive by Julian David Stone, who it's a dramatization of how Frankenstein was made, like basically the week up before shooting Frankenstein and all of the behind the scenes drama, who was going to direct, who was going to star as the monster. And it condenses some things into that week. Like, was Lemley Sr. actually going to allow Lemley Jr. make this movie? So it kind of condenses the timeline for dramatic purposes. But one of the storylines in there is that when Karloff Jr. is working on, when he's tapped to play the monster, he's also working on The Guilty Generation for, I believe it's Columbia Pictures. And he's under contract for so many days. He is not going to be able to get out of the shoot in time to play the monster. And the studio boss at Columbia is Harry Cohen, who is one of the real hard-ass studio magnets that you don't cross. Like, if you cross Cohen, your career is essentially dead. Like, he will make sure you are blacklisted going forward. And Lee finds, like, it's a small part, but it's like a pretty good role. Like, Karloff is well regarded for it. It's like a scene where Karloff is speaking on the phone, and Lee finds a way to shoot it where Karloff is able to do everything in one day, wrap all his lines, wrap production, and go shoot Frankenstein. And I wasn't able to confirm that in other places, but if that did happen, it seems to like track with like what I've learned about Lee and other reading, that he was someone that wanted to make things happen for his performers. Like, he would go to the mat, and you see that here with Bela Lugosi.
And that actually sounds vaguely familiar to me. Like I might have read it in a Karloff biography.
Mm-hmm.
I can't confirm it either, but
it
sort of rings a bell.
Okay. So Whale is like not interested at all at coming back for Son of Frankenstein. Like, he's all done. By the time of Son of Frankenstein, by the time Lee is tapped to direct this, he already has 51 movies under his belt. He's done Count of Monte Cristo. He's done Three Musketeers. He has a reputation of being really easy to work with. He's really thoughtful. He's very skilled, but he's a bit of like a work for hire type. He's not considered a real auteur. And I found this quote. It's a really great article by William Fisher on Collider of like how Son of Frankenstein got made. He has this great perception on the role of the director. Every time a director looks through his camera lens, he is looking directly into the eyes of millions upon millions of people. The vast audience is countless times greater than all of the persons who saw and heard Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and all the other prophets combined. What a privilege. What an obligation. So it's kind of a guy that on one hand is a work for hire type. He can get the job done and get it done on time, but also like sees himself as like bigger than Jesus. So those two things are hard to reconcile. But he's tapped to do this. Peter Lorre was considered for the role of Frankenstein, as was Claude Rains. But they were passed over for Basil Rathbone, who I don't know much about aside that he played Sherlock Holmes.
That was his big thing. He also he was in quite a few Universal movies during this era. Tower of London is one of his better known ones from this period. So yeah, he had quite a long and successful career.
One thing I note, Lee significantly beefed up the role of Ygor. He allowed Lugosi to come up with a backstory and motivation for the character, and he let that inspiration carry over to the screen. The original shooting script had little, if any, Ygor in it, and Lee wrote much of it on the fly. If Karloff's star had dimmed from the heights of Bride of Frankenstein, Lugosi, as we mentioned, truly had fallen on hard times. He was reliant on the Motion Picture Relief Fund for any income, and he had basically been unemployed since 1936. By 1938, he had lost his home. Universal, knowing they had leverage over a desperate Lugosi, they cut his rate. Like, he was supposed to make $1,000 a week. They cut him to $500 a week. And Lee heard that and said, all right, well, I am just going to keep writing more material for you, and I am going to guarantee that you are going to be on this picture until the very last day of filming. I have this quote from the article talking about that and what he decided to do. It says, by then, Lee was attached to Son of Frankenstein as producer and director, and the film was considered in production. After receiving Universal's new terms, Lugosi and his wife pleaded with Lee for aid. In an interview with Mank, Lillian Lugosi took great delight in relating his response. That would be Lee's response. Those goddamn sons of bitches. I'll show them. I'm going to keep Bela on this picture from the first day of shooting right up to the last. So he basically let Universal know, okay, if you're going to cut his pay in half, I'll make sure he's going to earn every bit of pay he would have made if he made $1,000. And this is, I think, Lugosi's like best role. Like, I think this is better than Dracula. I absolutely love Lugosi, and he is the star of this movie. Like, Karloff is a distant third. Filming begins November 9th, 1938. Ward goes back to the studio. Lee is working, quote, without script. And I found these production notes. November 19th. We are still operating without a completed script, receiving only a few pages spasmodically, but just before we complete a sequence. November 26th. We are still operating under the most difficult circumstances to make a picture. That is, without script, which prevents us from laying out a schedule or figuring a budget. December 10th. We still have no script upon which to base this estimated final day of shooting. Lee should be in a better position than we are to know just how much he has left to do, because the story, and I love this, appears to be altogether in his mind. So this is just Lee winging it on set. This is brilliant. I love this.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I mean, especially at this time, that's just not how movies were made at all.
Yeah. And because, like, Hollywood back then is less a writer's game and more, more a director's gig and more a writer's gig, right? It feels like writers and producers are the ones in ultimate control.
Yeah, I mean, writers didn't get paid much, but is still the case. But they
maybe I'm thinking just producers are the ones.
But the script was king, though. I mean, you shot the script. I mean, that's what was submitted to the Hays Code, was the script. Things like that.
Yeah. So I found this other note, because Lee kept Cooper on hand to, quote unquote, do the last minute rewrites. Like, he basically would dictate to Lee. And the story is obviously far different, because there's no army, there's no mustache twirling Frankenstein demanding another mate and then trying to do brain surgery on Peter. Cooper would write a script for the radio thriller Quiet Please. There was an episode called Rain on New Year's Eve, and it's about a writer being held prisoner by the director of a, quote, poor man's Frankenstein. And it's basically Cooper, like, writing through his feelings. You can find this episode on YouTube. I plan on sitting down and listening to it maybe during the next snow or rainstorm. It's about 20 minutes in length. I'll maybe plug it here in the show notes, but it's like Cooper's like, fuck you to Lee for keeping him on hand and having his whole script redone. I just find that is just really brilliant right there. So
that is funny.
Lee wrapped filming on January 4th, 1939. Movie came in at about $120K over budget. It was about $400,000 altogether. He had 3 days to edit and score the movie for a studio preview. 3 days. That's incredible. The cast aside, Lugosi made what would amount to like $80,000 in 2023 for his work. Lee kept his promise. Lee made the 3-day deadline. He got the movie edited and scored for this preview, and it was released January 13th, 1939. And we're recording on January 13th, 2024, which wasn't planned, but happy anniversary, Son of Frankenstein, you son of a bitch.
Yeah, I saw that this morning and thought, well, that is just fortuitous. This is very
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Love it. So we're wearing party hats.
Yeah.
We have streamers.
Happy 85th
There's a
birthday.
cake.
Yeah.
Always an excuse for a cake.
Yeah.
All right. We've talked Lugosi. We've talked Karloff. We got to talk about one other person who, if he's not going to be a major player in the next 5 movies, he's kind of our utility infielder. He's going to come in. He's going to do whatever he's asked to do. Mr. Lionel Atwill, who here he's going to play the one-armed Inspector Krogh, and he's going to knock it out of the park. Like this is his best role in any of the 5 Frankensteins. We'll see him.
Yeah.
Brian, Nat, Jess, I feel like y'all could speak about, because I've gone on for about 10 minutes now, and if anybody would like to chime in on Mr. Atwill before I talk about maybe the seedier side of him, let's give him his flowers first.
Okay, yeah, because his performance kind of makes this movie along with Lugosi, but he represents so many of my favorite things about this movie, which is he is the stand-in for the entire village in so many ways, because what is singularly funny about this movie to me, that's why I revisit this movie so often, is that Wolf has such an uphill battle from the beginning to try and win these people over, and he does not even try. And that is the funniest thing about it. But the inspector represents all of that, as he is laden with PTSD, and he has this entire horrific backstory that he relates to Wolf, because he's like the guy who's like, I am on your side, man. I am trying so hard to help you. And it's just, there's 2 of my favorite scenes in this movie. One, the monologue where he explains the arm, and Wolf barely listens. And then my single favorite shot in the movie that's just genuinely great performing on his part is when the boy is talking about meeting the monster, and his giant friend, and he talks about the giant taking him by the arm, and there's a cutaway to the inspector touching his own arm as he hears it. That's my single favorite shot in the film.
I love that. His and the acting he does with his eyes there too, as he like glances over towards Wolf, who's trying not to look at the inspector. Like that's a great. I definitely want to get into the back and forth between Wolf and Krogh throughout this picture, because I think it's some of the genuinely best acting, intensest moments in this movie for sure. What else? Before Son of Frankenstein, he had quite a run in a number of Universal and horror films before this, and had appeared with Basil Rathbone before. Like what made Lionel Atwill such like a great character actor, especially in like genre films?
I think he's fantastic in the pair of Warner Brothers films that came out in 1932, 33, Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum. He's just fantastic in these, and those are cool movies, and I love that we finally have been able to see them in full color. Or full 2-strip Technicolor, so not technically full color, but you know what I mean. Those have finally been restored after all these years, and he's so fun in those. Dr. X, especially, I think is just a blast. The synthetic flesh thing is just like kind of hilarious and kind of amazing, and yeah, I have a great time with that movie. The Mystery of the Wax Museum, of course, was remade in 53 with Vincent Price's House of Wax, and it's essential. The movies are really similar, but what's great about those, they're directed by Michael Curtiz, so they've got sort of that great quality of his work behind it, and sort of an expressionist feel that you see in the whale films as well. So it's great, and so Atwill has some genre credibility behind him before he gets to Son of Frankenstein, and sort of finishes out the franchise with various versions. I mean, it's different versions of the Krog character, more or less, but without the missing arm and just not as fleshed out and not quite as interesting.
I really love Lionel Atwill. Something a lot of my favorite character actors have in common is they have this undercurrent of humor and intelligence. I always feel like there's more going on. They're bringing more to a character than what's on the page, and I'd like to talk about the script later on, because I think that's really fascinating, the way they were kind of flying, kind of working without a net there. Inspector Kemp is who you're thinking of, by the way, in Young Frankenstein. And I found Krog so funny, and I couldn't tell how much of that was me projecting from Young Frankenstein and how much of it was the film itself. I need to revisit Son of Frankenstein several times to kind of extricate it from my experience.
I need to revisit Young Frankenstein. Yeah. It's been 20 years, I think, since I've watched it.
Personally, I don't feel like Kenneth Mars really exaggerates, except for like the really, really thick accent and, like the monocle on top of the eye. It doesn't seem like he exaggerates that much from Lionel Atwill. And I love that.
Yeah, Atwill, when he's doing the really mechanical movements, it's already all there anyway. He's just replicating it rather than exaggerating.
And Atwill has those pipes, that deep, authoritative voice where he immediately commands your respect. Can we talk? I guess now is as good of a time to talk about it, because I don't know if we're going to talk about Atwill as much in the next 4 movies. So he'll show up in 5 Frankenstein movies. He's going to exit at the same time as Jack Pierce. Neither Pierce nor Atwill will be in the Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein movie. He'll play a different character, as Brian mentioned, in each of these films. He leaves for a different reason than Jack Pierce, for personal reasons, scandal. So he married 4 or 5 times.
As did most of these guys, I shouldn't mention.
A lot of Karloff also married 5 times. Lugosi married 4 or 5 times.
Vincent Price.
Price. He had this thing about homes, one of his homes burned to the ground in California. I think one washed out to sea on the East Coast. But what really did him in was rumors over his sexual proclivities. There were long rumors in Hollywood that his Palisades home doubled basically as a venue for hosting orgies and screening pornographic films, which would have been illegal at that time. That would have been very illegal. And Atwill himself was rumored to have directed some of these movies. It was also rumored that some of the women that performed in them were not at the age of consent, and also maybe not performing of their own volition as well. So there's an incident that's been dubbed the Yuletide orgy in the winter of 40 or 41, where a guest eventually tries to blackmail him, and the case ends up in court where Atwill commits perjury, saying no such sex parties have ever taken place. And he also bribes a convicted check forger to back up his story. In June of 41, a jury decides they believe Atwill's testimony and that all that's going on at his home is good, clean, wholesome fun at his estate. I think they think, oh yeah, they're watching travelogue videos, where people go on vacation. Later that year, the Yuletide affair is back in court for a different case, and I found an article from the Philly Inquirer where I'm going to bring it up. I won't read the whole article because there's some racially insensitive comments in here, but the first section of it. Headline is Lionel Atwill's home revealed an orgy trial at nude revel scene. And folks, they don't write headlines this anymore.
That's something.
So, special to the Inquirer, Los Angeles, May 12th. An attorney's slip of the tongue in open court lifted the lid off the Hollywood orgy scandal today and revealed for the first time that the nude revel to which 16-year-old from Hibbling, Minnesota, was a witness took place in the beach home of Lionel Atwill, noted actor of stage and screen. was testifying before Superior Judge Thomas Ambrose in the trial of Virginia Lopez, her roommate, on a morals charge. She had just told how embarrassed she was when attacked by Eddie LaRue, a movie colony figure, in the presence of Miss Lopez. Atwill named, and you were embarrassed when you cavorted in the nude at the home of Lionel Atwill last December in front of 6 people, 3 of whom you had never met before, asked Donald McKay, counsel for Miss Lopez. Before Sylvia could answer, Assistant District Attorney Roll objected. The Atwill party is now before the grand jury and should not be dragged into this case. Following a huddle by the attorneys for both sides with Judge Ambrose, the question remained unanswered, but was not stricken from the record. So basically now Atwill has to go back to court because he's been named in this case without being expected to, and he has to admit, I committed perjury last year when I was on the stand in my earlier case. He's indicted, he's found guilty, he's given 5 years probation. The judge goes easy on him, he commutes the sentence, and he expunges the record, but the damage is done. In Atwill, because of the Hays Code, and Hays is like, we are not allowing you to hire anybody like this, and the studios basically blacklist him. He's only going to get tiny roles in Poverty Row pictures until his death from lung cancer in 1946. So pretty sad end. And again, like, a lot of the stuff is hearsay. There's nothing that's necessarily, there's a lot of different stories, so who knows. But it is very weird thinking of like this guy, Lionel Atwill, playing these roles, being the guy that is like apparently hosting the wildest like Boogie Night style sex parties back in the 30s and 40s. And also getting dragged in front of a court for like cavorting nude. Like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
What would the 30s have done with OnlyFans? Like, if you had OnlyFans in the 1930s, the country would have imploded. It just would have been. We would.
Well, we think of the past as being some sort of chase time, but hey, people had the same kinks and passions that they do now. So
there is nothing new under the sun.
Well, there's that. You've seen the Holdovers? You know, the part where he shows him the plate. You know, the ancient plate that's got the porn on it. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about this movie. We've talked about the background. We went deep. And again, I think this might be the last one till we get to the Abbott and Costello, that there's like a lot of production information, but we'll see. But let's start at the end, because I think one of the things is the enduring legacy of this movie. And I know, Nat, that's something you're very interested in. And Jess, like, you came to this movie after Young Frankenstein, really. And I'm wondering, is that the enduring legacy of this movie, that it serves as the template for Young Frankenstein? And what is it about Young Frankenstein that made it kind of like endure in the pop culture so much?
Because it's something I've been interested in for years, because Mel Brooks is one of my favorite filmmakers, just in general, because every parody he does is done with so much reverence and style for the films that in the style of the films that he's parodying. And Young Frankenstein is fascinating because, like, I also love Dracula Dead and Loving It, which he did years and years later. Mm-hmm. But Dracula Dead and Loving It takes the original Dracula as its template, because there is so much dead air in that movie to layer jokes over the top of. And the approach with Young Frankenstein and Son of Frankenstein is so different, because Son of Frankenstein is already so funny in so many ways, and conceptually, in the way that Wolf just keeps like slamming on his face in front of these people, and how little he barely tries to hide what he's doing. It's like there was already so much that was funny about this movie that Brooks just kind of cranked it all the way up and like broke the dial. And I think because of that, because he recognized the potential in this film, to set that kind of story, that I think that is a huge part of its legacy, along with the look of the monster and how that persisted so much through pop culture in the 60s and the 70s, especially in the 70s being the Marvel comic template for their Monster of Frankenstein series. Even, I forgot what I was going to say. But yeah, those were kind of, oh, even Ygor, just the name Ygor stemming from this movie,
Right.
even though pop culturally, ego is an amalgamation of mad scientist assistant tropes. This is still right here, like the birth of ego. There's so much that we recognize of Frankenstein in pop culture that you're not going to see when you just go be like, oh, I'm going to watch the original Frankenstein and think you're going to see all these things. So much comes from this movie.
What about the look of the monster too? Because I feel like there was a time, especially with things like Famous Monsters, that like the woolly shirted monster was even more pervasive than the black suit coated monster for a time.
Mm-hmm.
Like that seemed to be something we would see everywhere as well.
That's funny because that's not something I really saw until much later, when I found like the things you wanted to know about monsters but were afraid to ask book. I hadn't seen that look for the monster until later. Somehow I had seen the sweater and the suit coat the most often. I was even kind of surprised when I finally saw Bride, to see it's torn up and stuff,
Yeah.
so because I was just so used to the original look from the first film.
Yeah, I think I think what Young Frankenstein does, I agree with Nat that the reverence and the affection that Mel Brooks has for the original films and for James Whale and for Son is part of why Young Frankenstein kind of helps cement the legacy of the original Frankenstein films. Not that they needed assistance in that regard, but it's kind of making a great film, a gorgeous film. Young Frankenstein is really beautiful. Like obviously it used a lot of the same sets and everything, but it's shot really beautifully. Making this great film, sending up these originals, but in an affectionate way. I think that's really key rather than doing it in a condescending or mean-spirited way. It's very affectionate, very respectful, but still very funny. And it's really interesting to me seeing the humor evolve from film to film, because Bride is hilarious, Son is hilarious, and there's a lot of humor, in the original as well. I think it can be easy, especially for younger people or people who don't have as much context for older films, to assume that they're dry and not very funny. Like we were talking about, with the sex parties, like people assume things that happened before them were boring and there's no sex, there's no humor, there's nothing, but these movies are very, very funny. And I think it just kind of cements that legacy and underscores, go back and reevaluate, because this is funnier than you remember. There's inherent humor there, but, Whale had the camp factor, and Son is just so dry and funny. And my experience with the fuzzy vested Frankenstein, I think of that as hippie Frankenstein, because that's very 60s and 70s to me. But that was something that I grew up with and didn't really know where it came from until I saw Son. So it's really interesting kind of connecting the pop culture dots there. But yeah, I just Ygor as a pop culture figure is really interesting to me. It's kind of dropped out of not out of nowhere, but dropped out of from this film that's not as well known as the original in Bride. But yeah,
I think people watch Dwight Fry in Frankenstein and assume that he's not named Fritz, that he's named Ygor. I think that's one of the things that we talked about. No, it's Fritz. But that's like the template. And then you watch this and it's like Ygor, like Lugosi is Ygor. You can forget that like that is like that what the characters or that is like where all of the future like hunchback assistants come from. And I guess that leads to my kind of like next question. I wonder if this movie almost gets passed over. Like every article I read, there was at least one sentence that said, when considering the Frankenstein movies, everyone talks James Whale's 2 entries, but immediately kind of glosses over Son of Frankenstein. And it does feel like this one maybe gets a little bit of a short shrift when it comes to like the original. Like we talked, like we were going to only do the first 3 movies because it felt like the 3 strongest before we decided to do all of them. But even that, like this feels like it gets glossed over compared to Whale's films in terms of its how people regard its impact and where it stands in terms of its cultural cachet and importance.
Well, like we said, even we are probably not going to have a 3-hour conversation on this one. Mm-hmm. But I mean, which, hey, if we do, we do. But I think there is the perception, like, okay, in Gods and Monsters, the movie, James Whale says he made the first 2 and the rest were made by hacks. And I think that's sort of the perception that comes from this. And this one, I think this has a lot of style, particularly in the visuals. I think it has a lot of callbacks to some of the same kinds of things that Whale was inspired by, like the German expressionist look. I think there's in some ways more of that German expressionism here mm-hmm. than there is in the Whale films. There's a lot going mm-hmm. for this one. And it's sort of a continuation of the humor, the kind of humor we found in the second film in particular. But maybe because it's just not directed by a quote unquote auteur, that mm-hmm. it is sort of given, it's knocked down a little bit in some of those respects. And, personally, I think it's probably the 3rd best movie, mm-hmm. but I do really like it a lot. And I think it has a lot more going for it than is often credited to it.
Yeah.
I think it's just, especially with its legacy now, for trying to convince people to watch it now. It's easy to convince people to watch the first 2 Frankensteins and not so much the rest of the series. And I think it's just, for Horford, it's the curse of the beloved sequel, where you have a sequel that is like the most beloved of all time, and then you have the ones after it that people are not going to be as open to because this is the one. It reminds me, in a lot of respects, of another movie that I've been on this podcast about, which is Alien 3,
mm-hmm.
where you had Aliens. It was like the biggest sequel success ever. And then you have an attempt to go back to the tone of the first, but people loved the second one so much. And I think that is a bit of the issue that people often I see having with Son of Frankenstein, which is the monster's not talking again. We've kind of gone back to a basics approach, even though so much of that humor carries over and it has so much of its own distinct style. It's like people wanted a lot more of what the second one was doing.
And it is hard to live up to the legacy of Bride of Frankenstein, which is considered like the peak of Universal monster movies. Like it's considered the best one. I have that as I think the best of them. And then like maybe The Invisible Man or the original Frankenstein for me. Like it kind of alternates between those two for me, because The Invisible Man is just like so much fun and another like really good black comedy, and the effects still hold up to this day as well, that almost anything would seem like a letdown. But like this on its own, I think has a lot going for it. We've kind of touched a little bit on the design, and I made the comment in my notes that I do miss a little bit of James Whale's kind of production design savvy, like having these really lush, elaborate sets, like the kind of contrast in the 2 forests that you see in Bride of Frankenstein when the monster first enters and it's very ornate and beautiful, versus when he's chased down and it's like desolate and barren. The opulence of the House of Frankenstein and Victor's lifestyle, and then that richness of the village in the original Frankenstein when the villagers are like celebrating the soon-to-be wedding. I miss a little bit of that here, but I know the three of you disagree. Like you've said, no, like you actually love the look. So speak to that. Speak to what really stands out in the, and there are some things I really like here as well, but what stands out in terms of the world Lee builds here?
I think I do love the look of the first two films. I'm not disparaging those in the slightest. I love them. It's the gothic atmosphere is incredible. I think one scene in particular that stuck out to me when Wolf and his wife are at the dining room table, and it's this really stark, empty room. It's really cavernous with these angled shadows or light from a window against the wall. It's really avant-garde. It's going back to what Brian said about it leans more into German expressionism. It reminds me of a shot from Night of the Hunter with these really steep angles. And it feels to me like a Kafka adaptation or a Pinter play or something, where it's really kind of leaning into the surreal, like the unreality is heightened in this movie to me, which I really appreciate. It feels like when they descend on Frankenstein, they're entering a different world, and kind of how stark and minimalist the sets are adds to that for me. So I think it heightens the horror, but it also heightens the humor because it is so exaggerated, but we still feel kind of like we're in the real world. But I really like how much it leans into it.
It feels like a snow globe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it feels like that kind of like you could shake it up at any time. It feels like you're looking in on that,
And speaking of snow globes, I think the design of Frankenstein's manor in particular reminds me of Xanadu and Citizen Kane, because there are like these big fireplaces, but then there's like all this empty space that makes it look massive, even though it's not necessarily that big in reality. And so those angular, pillars and different things that are in the rooms, like decoration is much more minimal. There's like nothing. And then there's those, like the chairs and stuff are just gigantic. And so it just sort of dwarfs all the actors a little bit. And it just gives this sense of the wealth and opulence of the Frankensteins achieved through just minimal choices. And I think that goes a long way for me.
Yeah.
My favorite, I also made a note of the production design because for me, I love the combination of like Art Deco, German Expressionism style. So it looks like a weird cross between Batman the Animated Series and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
But what I love is that like you have all this angular, exaggerated stuff, and you don't have necessarily the Gothic style of James Whale, except because so much of the action is centered on inside the house in this movie. And what I love is that you have all of that James Whale style just outside the window. You can see the spindly trees and the raging storm through the window. So what it feels like, I don't know if it was remotely intentional or not, but it's part of the genius. One of the smartest things about the movie for me is that it feels like all of that is being kept at bay. It's like the storm that was his father's story is just outside the walls, and we're like closed off from it, but we can still see it, we can still feel it creeping in.
Well, to me, the way that thunder and lightning storm hits, like whether you're watching the couple like on the train make their way to Castle Frankenstein, or when they're watching it outside that gorgeous like bay window, and they're watching, you have that large like basically dead tree that the lightning keeps threatening to strike, and you see like the pounding rain. I think that is like probably some of the best detail, and to me it's still one of the best thunder and lightning storms in like a horror movie ever. And I think it's a really wonderful detail. That was like the one production note that I really love about this movie. And just like watching the Eastern European landscape pass in front of them when they're riding the train, I thought was a really beautiful detail as well. I really loved that. What stood out on my last rewatch, there was a moment at the end when the creature is holding Peter's book. It's a book of fairy tales. And what struck me was thinking back to the way the exterior buildings look, and especially those windows where you've mentioned like the very sharp angular look. And the windows are not squared off. Like the windows have these really odd angles that all the panes sit in. Even within like the four panes themselves, they sit at odd degrees. And to me, they exterior buildings and the way the molding looks, the way the roofing is set, they look like illustrations at times out of a children's fairy tale book. And you're almost like seeing a children's fairy tale externalized and then brought to the screen. And I thought that was like maybe like a visual detail that Lee was bringing out here as well. So I thought that was fascinating as well, because he's showing Peter's book. I know you're partly doing that because you're watching the light bulb go off in the creature's brain, like, oh, I will set my evil plan into motion. But I thought it connected the two worlds a little bit there as well. So it's different from Whale's Look, and I can appreciate what you're all saying too about why that starkness, but it is so much different from what we've seen in those first two. And hey, who doesn't love a good sulfur pit as well, right? I mean, every movie should have that. This is yet another movie about a son trying to measure up to the legacy of his father. Like we've talked about that in the original Frankenstein, to a certain degree. Bride of Frankenstein, with the monster demanding his father make him a creature. And here you have Wolf trying to, in some ways, redeem the legacy of Henry von Frankenstein. But very early on, we know that like Wolf doesn't know his father. He's only heard stories about him. Everything he knows about his father comes secondhand from his mother, Elizabeth. So that gives us a little bit of information that after Bride, one of two things happened. Either Henry died very soon after, or the marriage was a very short one, and Elizabeth escaped with her child to England first, and then eventually the United States. In that Wolf heard great stories about his dad, but never got to know the man personally. And I find that really fascinating.
That's also one of the funniest things about the movie
Mm-hmm.
for me, is that he walks into town and everybody has this generational trauma of what his father did to this town. And he just is immediately like, yeah, I ain't reading all that. Happy for you, though. We're sorry it happened. But it's just like, he never met the man. He didn't know the man, but instead of listening to anything they're saying, he's just like, yeah, it really sounds like you guys deserved what was coming to you. It sounds like my dad was the coolest dude that ever lived. I'm really sorry for you.
When he says, like, I didn't know my dad, but your struggles were in the front of his mind. He was a great man. And then everybody grumbles and walks away. It's awesome. It's really... You see the look on his face, like just belly flops into it. It is great how many, well, the best time he puts his foot in his mouth in the whole movie is like, did you even see this monster that my father made? And he's like, he ripped my fucking arm off. It's just wonderful.
That's a fantastic shot with all the umbrellas gathered, but it's also positively Springfieldian with the people drifting away and drifting off, and the comedic timing is very Simpsons to me. I really love it.
Yeah. But there is this idea that in some ways, like, Wolf feels this obligation like why even return to his father's ancestral home in the first place? Like, seems like he has quite a good life in America. Like, he's a college professor, and he's a college professor at a time where that would be like a very stable, well-paying job during a time of like great economic uncertainty. So he has a pretty cushy life. Like, the Frankensteins are obviously a family of already great means and great wealth. So it's not like they're returning to his home out of desperation, like, well, this is it. Like, we have nothing else. We have to return home because we have nowhere else to go. But he feels a sense of a calling in a certain way, because he feels like his father has done this thing that in some ways is great, but it's great and also terrible. Like, I imagine that it's a very long shadow to live under, that your dad has created life from scratch. Like, he's the first person to do that. And you are, I don't even know what he was a doctor of, but you feel like no matter what you've done, like, you're not going to live up to, like, you're always going to fall somewhere beneath him in the pecking order. And you're not going to leave the same legacy behind. I'm sure you want to scratch that itch a little bit more once your own son's Peter is born, and you start thinking about, like, well, what is my legacy going to be?
Mm-hmm.
And now, what is Peter's legacy going to be after that? But you're right, Nat. He ain't listening to a damn person in the town of Frankenstein, which it's not named Frankenstein in the first two movies. Like, it's somewhere along the line, the town is named Frankenstein, which you think, with all of them gone, they could rename it something else.
But they just want to underscore and remind themselves of their, collective trauma for generation from generation. I don't know.
These Burgermeisters are not very efficient. But it's also a movie about brothers. Like, I think Ygor at one point points out, like, your father, you are your father's son, but so is the creature. Like, your father was also the father to this creature, and the father essentially abandoned both of his sons. Neither of the sons knows their father. Karloff doesn't get a lot to do here. If there's one thing about this movie, is Karloff does take a back seat. And I think, Brad, you even noted he gets second billing under Rathbone. He really should be third
He
billed.
should be in this one. He just doesn't have that much to do for so much of it. He's just laying on the table for so long, or just kind of jerking around, that's a bad choice of words, but you know what, I just sort of lumbering around the place, I guess. It's not, it's sort of except for a couple of moments, a couple of scenes, it's sort of the caricature that Lugosi talked about it being, and why he didn't want to play the character, so yeah, he's more or less used as the blunt instrument of revenge for a big portion of this movie as well. Well, it's sort of a continuation and sort of the next step after what Pretorius was using him for in the previous film.
Right. And they go back to the eugenics argument, or at least Wolf does. Like, Wolf is excusing his father's mistakes.
Yeah.
Like, Wolf says, if it wasn't for like and I believe he even used like a hunchbacked evil assistant who put like an abnormal brain in the creature, he would have been fine.
And they spend all of Bride of Frankenstein ignoring that plot point. So, and they spend, frankly, most of the first movie ignoring that plot point too.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like Bride of Frankenstein doesn't exist in this world, right? It's almost like I'm trying to think of like other it's almost like The Last Skywalker. Like, The Last Skywalker does everything to, wipe out like the movie before it, right? It's just like, that sequel never happened. Yeah. Like, that's what Son of Frankenstein is kind of doing here.
They David Gordon Green it.
Oh my goodness. Oh geez. Son of Frankenstein, the first requel, perhaps. Who knows? But there are some moments of brilliance with Karloff. There are some really wonderful moments. And I'm wondering if this first moment when Karloff first sees Wolf, do you feel, and he's like pawing at his face and looking at him and going back and forth, do you feel there's some recognition there? Do you feel that he recognizes him as his kin in that moment?
I do think it's meant for recognition, but I also think even on the monsters, right, even though the monster is barely conscious in this one, there's still a moment of like, oh shit, here we go again. There's another one.
When Karloff is allowed to tap into the pathos of the monster, like there's real beauty there. Like the, oh god, I'm still alive, the kind of an existential spiral, and then but also just the recognition, seeing a familiar face, and like I do think the idea of using him as a blunt instrument and the monster being used is a really fascinating idea that can be done well when it's not just rinse and repeat. So I like that moment a lot, and a couple of the other moments where Karloff really gets to shine in this movie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really love the scene where Karloff sees himself in the mirror.
Yeah.
I think that comes the closest to tapping into sort of the empathetic elements of the first two. It's sort of extending the sequence from the second movie where he sees his face in the water.
Yeah.
And he at first he's like, what is that thing? You know, and then he realizes, you know, by touching the rope that it's himself. And it's it's very heartbreaking the way that's played. And Karloff doesn't get a ton to do with that in this one, like in the previous. So it's good that there's something there, though.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think the mirror sequence is actually the sad, out of the three movies, it's actually the saddest sequence for the monster, because it's the moment the monster rejects himself.
Mm-hmm.
Like when he finally realizes, like, this is me, he completely and utterly rejects himself. And I think this is where like the monster not speaking actually works, because you only get those guttural grunts, and the physical acting that is done here in Karloff's part, I think says more than like the words could, because it's really heartbreaking. You know, it's heartbreaking because of the line, I listen to people reject themselves every day. And it's always heartbreaking when persons do that. And to watch the creature do this in such a visceral, physical way. And then he drags Wolf over and does a side-by-side comparison of just like the physical features of the two. And you see him like look at Wolf in his, like, in Basil Rathbone is like a very attractive person for his day, and then he looks at himself and then he rejects himself again. And there's that pleading thing that Karloff does as the monster, where he outstretches both arms and makes those kind of like semicircles with his arms, like, and he's almost saying like, couldn't you be a doctor of plastic surgery? Like, couldn't you fix my face up a little bit? Maybe, like, you know, give me some features here. And I think that's a really wonderful moment. It's the other moment he has is like the wail of grief when he discovers Ygor's body is a genuine, because I think that is a real friendship between them. It's not just what the later movies will be like, all right, sick the monster on somebody, but there is a real kind of like buddy comedy aspect to their relationship. And when he sees Ygor dead, there's this real sadness that he lets out.
Yeah, those moments of like reaching and yearning always almost make me cry. In, you know, in the original, when he's reaching out to Maria, and it's interesting that it's always with water or a mirror, you know, with Maria by the water, and then seeing his own reflection, those gestures outward, and finally kind of shutting down. I like seeing the evolution across the three movies of that, but just those simple, just reaching outward and hitting a brick wall between himself and somebody else, even if it's transparent. I really love that, and I love seeing that across even Karloff's non-Frankenstein performances, that kind of reaching out for humanity that he's so good at.
Yeah. Although, despite... Oh, sorry, Nat, you first.
Oh, I was just going to comment on, as we were talking about the relationship between Ygor and the monster, which is one of the strengths of the movie. To me, it felt very much like, Of Mice and Men was hot off the presses at this time. And it's a little like if George and Lenny were murderers, if instead of being like, Lenny, don't kill people, it's like, Lenny, don't kill people except the ones on my shopping list.
Right.
These are the names of people you're allowed to kill. And I think there's something very darkly funny about that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is the monster at his most monstrous here. Like, because he's not just... He knows what he's doing. Like, there's that scene at the apothecary where he's, like, ducking behind the window, pulling down the shade, and then giving him a judo chop, which the judo chop is awesome. Like, that is... that is so good. But, like, the monster seems like he's possesses his wits about him and knows exactly what he's doing and is more than happy. Let's talk about the wielder of that blunt instrument, and let's talk about the man who really steals the show here. And I do have like one quick production note, like what Lee said about his work with Lugosi, that when he finished shooting, there was no doubt in anyone's mind he, being Lugosi, stole the show, and that he said, Lee said, Karloff's work was weak by comparison, which is like, wow, like Lugosi does really steal the show here. I like and prefer Lugosi's Ygor to his work as Dracula. And I think partly because I prefer comedy, and Lugosi is an absolute goddamn hoot as Ygor. Like, just that introduction with Wolf when he's like, why'd you try to kill me? I thought you were trying to kill me. It's like, oh, you son of a bitch. So good. What do we make? And what are some of the highlights here? And why is this so memorable?
The thing that stood out to me was the fact that Lugosi, the amount of freedom he had with the character was the thing that I knew most about this movie from its production standpoint. Was just, I knew how free he was to almost make it up on the spot. And that's what it's always felt like to me when I watch this movie. Is it feels like someone on SNL being like, I've been working on this character, let me show it to you. And it just absolutely has the vibe of a comedian with like this thing where like, oh my God, I've been working on this guy. Let me let him loose. And it is just so funny how much freedom he's given to go completely off the wall with it.
Yeah, he's clearly having the time of his life with it. Like, I kept making notes of his dialogue just because I made a lot of notes on the dialogue because the script, I was obsessed. But the way he says he does things for me, just the relish in his voice, it is so funny and so creepy. And when he's, but his mother was lightning. Like, it gave me chills, but it was also very like funny and melodramatic, but it's just poetry. I'm obsessed with how much fun he's having with this role.
Absolutely. What else stood out to you about Lugosi's delivery? Like, what other lines, and in particular how he delivered them, stood out to you, Jess?
Honestly, those were the two that I made notes on. Like, he does things for me. I think I rewound it 3 or 4 times just to listen to him say that. Just there was a little too much sexual frisson on it for my, like, it was for my comfort, but I loved it at the same time.
I almost joked about that right now. I'm like, did you think they were maybe like just two men there?
No, they have explored each other's bodies. He does things for him. I'm sorry. I really appreciate that they added. I mean, this is already a perverted story. Like, you can't watch Bride of Frankenstein, and but and I like that they added even more on top of it. It's just they're really going for it, which I appreciate.
Yeah, Well, also, like, everyone underestimates Ygor. That is part of the beauty here too. Is everyone just thinks of Ygor as this kind of like dim-witted hunchback that they can kind of like lord over. They literally like just throw him in the old castle and to be done with him. And he plays Wolf like a fiddle, like absolutely manipulates Wolf, and he's able to play on Wolf's ego and his eccentricities and Wolf's own insecurities about his lack of a relationship with the dad. But Ygor is also able to manipulate the council of the Burgermeisters, like, and aside from like the fear of being hung again, he doesn't show any fear or any sort of deference to them. And when one of them says like, I'll hang you again myself, he's like, you on your own? Like, it took 8 of you last time. And he's like, there aren't 8 of you anymore. 6 of you are already dead. It's great. Like, he is cocky in those moments. Because everybody has underestimated him. And I absolutely love that about Ygor. And it really shines. It's Lugosi's performance. Like, it's humorous, but there's also that menace that is there. Like, he hasn't forgotten how to be scary when he needs to be.
You really get to see what he can do when he really is sort of let loose in this. And like everyone has said, he's so funny and just sort of, but it's still scary enough, when he needs to be. It just works so well. It's just, he feels even more tailor-made for this than for Dracula. It's just like, it's so great.
Yeah. But I feel like in the later movies, everyone's going to want to revive the monster because it can be used as that blunt instrument. Everyone's going to want to revive the monster to basically so it can kill on command. Ygor wants that because he has that, the hateful 8 list, the 8 burgers that he wants to have killed. But he does have this genuine affection for the creature. And you see that in the physical performance of Lugosi. There's that moment where he feels like Wolf is hurting the creature when he tries to revive it. And he almost steps between the two of them, like, because he doesn't want to see the creature hurt in any way. He genuinely understands, like, when the monster is rejecting himself by looking in the mirror and it's that reflection that is upsetting him. Ygor understands, like, the physical language of the monster, and he moves immediately to turn the mirror around and then offers like comfort to the monster. And he tells the monster, hey, it's the doctor, you can trust him. He's like the go-between. And I love that for them. I love that there's not just this is just a weapon for me. Like, there's a genuine, much like the Hermit, and I don't think it's any coincidence that Ygor dresses a lot like the Hermit does, and he has that heavy beard a lot like the Hermit does. The monster probably has a little bit of recognition and says, like, this is probably someone I can trust. If they're thinking, that far ahead in production, who knows? But this is someone that I can trust. The Ygor, another outcast, is saying, I am someone that will stand by you and trust you. And I really do appreciate that about this relationship.
Yeah, he's sort of a bit of Pretorius, a bit of the Hermit, even using music to sort of command and control the monster in this case, rather than just entertain him. Yeah. And of course, Fritz and Carl as well. He's hanged for stealing bodies, which is very much a Carl kind of thing.
So they said.
Yeah, so they said.
So they said.
I love how he just sort of, when he's in the courtroom, he just sort of coughs on the guy. Sorry, a bone was stuck in my throat.
Yeah. Good stuff. So hanging seems like that's quite a punishment for stealing bodies, isn't it? What else were you getting hung for in these days? Like jaywalking, hanging. Didn't tip 20%, hanging.
Well, we'll see. I don't know. That's an interesting thing to ponder.
Skip church on Sundays, hanging. God. Village of
Oh,
Frankenstein,
man.
pretty harsh place to
Yeah, it
live.
is. It is.
There is one great cut when Wolf, and I can't remember the wife's name because honestly, she's like such a non-factor in this movie.
Kind of is, yeah.
It's like, I guess Wolf has to be married in this movie. Like, I guess we have to do that. But he says to her, like, what do we have to be afraid of here? And it immediately cuts to Ygor like peering in on Peter as he's like sleeping in his bed.
Yeah.
It's like great cut, like absolutely no notes, chef's kiss, would watch again. What else do we have here? Oh, let's talk about this test of wills between Krog and Wolf, because I feel like this is also some of the best moments in the film. Like Krog is really torn between his sense of duty, like protecting the family, and I think he does a good job of not blaming Lady Frankenstein and Peter for being married to Wolf or being the son of Wolf. Like he doesn't hold any ill will towards them and wanting to protect the family, versus also like, your dad built this thing that ripped off my arm and you're kind of a smarmy asshole. And Wolf, knowing that he's guilty, like he did the thing he said he wouldn't do. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to revive the creature. And then a week later, I revive the creature. And he does that thing that a lot of us do. Like, I know I'm guilty of it. Like when I do something I said I wouldn't do, I get loud and uppity about it and hope that nobody notices. Like Wolf immediately takes things to 10. Like, how dare you? I'm a prisoner in my own home. These backwards people. I love these. What do we make of these like moments between the two in the library or the study?
They're most of my favorite scenes in the movie because Krug, he's the most patient man in the world. You know, your dad made this thing. You don't even know him, but I know his monster. It knows my arm. And he's just still coming at it from a place of being like, I'm trying to help you. This is, if you do this, this is what people are going to say. This is what people are going to think. I'm just relaying how the village sees you. Help me help you change that image. And he doesn't. And then over the course of the movie, he's like, you did it. You really went and did it. And now he like knows what Wolf is doing, and he's still trying to convince him to like stop, turn himself in. Like he's coming from it from more of a compassionate place than I would be after the first day. 10 minutes of meeting Wolf, you know what you're going to get. And so he's just spends the rest of the movie just dealing with it and listening to it and having to put up with it until he has all he can stand, and he can't stand no more.
Well, yeah, I mean, these are sort of the heart of the film. I mean, this is the primary conflict sort of personified in these two characters. And so they're just great sequences. And, down to, the dart match. And I love that part. And, where
the most aggressive dart match.
Yeah. And Krog is just not good at darts, but Frankenstein's real good. I mean, he's just like not even looking, and he's tossing them right there, And then of course you have the great moment where he sticks the bundle of darts into his fake arm, those again lifted into Young Frankenstein. So,
but I love that it's a test of wills between these two, and it's a game of like both know that the other knows more than they're letting on. Like Krog, like Wolf knows that Krog knows Wolf has been experimenting with a monster. Krog knows that Wolf knows this, and neither can really say what's going on here. There's this game of subterfuge. And you had mentioned that moment earlier, Nat, with like Peter saying like, I got a big giant, like in that Nashville couldn't be any further removed from like Eastern European English roots. By the way, like I would usually hate a little kid in a role like this. I don't know what it is, but like Peter is awesome. He's just like, I'm hunting lions and turtles and green giants in my room. Like, this kid's awesome. Like, give me a whole movie.
Something about his performance just feels really authentic, I think. It feels like a natural kid performance. It doesn't feel coached, like he was just, it's like, okay, say this, and then he says it in whatever strange sort of delivery he's going to give it. And they just like, all right, that's great. Let's move on.
From what I read, like the Donnie Donegan, who played him, like he said, like Lee told him, just be louder. Like, don't worry about the accent. Just like talk loudly. Like, don't sweat it. It's totally cool. And he's like, okay. And he's like, he was like, these movies are stupid. Like, even as a kid, he's like, these are just big dumb movies, which I would disagree with, but whatever. You see Krogh like being so patient, like leading the kid by the hand and trying to look out for him. And this test of wills. And I think Peter's really important to this movie for as little as he's in it, because at the end of the day, what Wolf has to realize is it's far more important for Wolf to be present in his own son Peter's life and be there as a father and raise his son and just be a part of his life, and rather than try to live up to this legacy and impress a father that is never there for him and can never be there for him. Like, there's nothing that Wolf can ever do that will win Henry's approval, because Henry is dead. Henry was never there to begin with for Wolf, and Henry will never have the opportunity to be there. He can't win his approval. But what Wolf can do is be a part of Peter's life, and he can have a hand in raising Peter. And that's going to be far more important going forward, what he can do in the here and now and what he can do going forward. And it really takes a monster trying to throw his son down a sulfur pit to learn that lesson. And hey, I had to learn the same lesson. Yeah. I can relate. I mean, who hasn't learned that lesson?
Yeah.
I know. I love this movie. I like the stuff with again, Ygor with Benson, like, oh, he won't tell anyone. And you're like, oh, Benson's death certificate has been signed. Like, I know, and and again, Benson is the first person the monster sees. And Benson is like brandishing a knife at him when he sees, and all the monster has done is like flutter his eyes a little bit. And what is the first thing he sees? Someone acting violently towards him.
Yeah.
I think we're killing it today. I think we might have the rare under. A couple notes I do have mentally. I think we need to start doing like a Frankenstein bingo card where Thunder and Lightning Storm, Hunchback,
Lionel Atwill,
absolutely. Torches and Pitchfork crowd. He's Alive.
Yeah.
Has to be in there. Like, all of the, we need
that was
some
in this
sort of
one too.
tally.
There wasn't there.
Here.
Yeah.
Kind of feels forced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sees his hand move. It's alive. Yeah.
It's alive. I do love at the end of this movie, Wolf is like literally run out of town on a rail. He's
they're like, all right, bye everybody. See you later. It's like, and they just leave. And it's like, no hard feelings. Bye.
So, yeah. We've killed a few. We've caused like at least 3 deaths in the town, right? At least 3, and they just get to leave. Like, God, to be rich, to be wealthy, unbelievable. Where do you think they go next? Do they just go back to America? And what do you think Peter's like, how I spent my summer vacation report is like? It's going to look like.
Yeah.
That is going to be. And like because that would now be a call to CPS. We have a kid reporting that a giant green monster tried to throw him
into
down a pit.
Yeah.
And his butler died after being strangled to death at home. I think you need to go out there and visit the family, because that's what I would have to do at this point. I mean, that, you're investigating that stuff now. Like, I get gaggle alerts at school all the time. Kids say like even slightly a little bit mean, like just what was it yesterday? Like I hate you, you should die, and they're just best friends joking on email. Like you read the whole email and it's clearly they're just two buddies joking. And you're like, you need to get involved in this. I'm like, oh no, I don't. Like it's just two buddies at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter talking about Jolly Green Giants like murdering his butler, like state's getting involved.
It might be undercut by the way he delivers it.
It might be.
Just be like, a big giant tried to kill my pa.
Oh. I don't think Peter's getting into science. I think we don't have to worry about Peter reviving the next generation of the monster.
Right.
I think that apple's falling far from the tree, if it even is falling at this point. Oh, poor dim Peter. Dim, sweet Peter. So, all right. What else do we have? Any final thoughts on Son of Frankenstein?
It's a fun one and shouldn't be overlooked.
It is.
And it's worth giving a look to, especially if you're a fan, like we've said, of Young Frankenstein, or those are sort of necessary viewing.
Well, that is our episode on Son of Frankenstein. This was a really fun one to talk about. We got to talk about orgies. We got to talk about throwing kids down sulfur pits. We got to talk about hunchbacks. I mean, all of our favorite things all in one episode. Birthday cake. I mean, it's really a 4-star banger. Before we go, let's plug a few things. And Nat, tell us what you have coming up. Talk about your book on Puppet Master and where can folks find you?
Yeah. So I did several appearances on this podcast before the book came out. And now, the book came out October 2021. Puppet Master Complete, a franchise history, available everywhere. It's now on audiobook from Encyclopocalypse as well. And also led to me writing the Puppet Master video game.
Whoa.
Yeah, I wrote the Toulon's journals for the game, which are the basis of the single player mode.
Mm-hmm.
And I may have some stuff coming up with the game, fingers crossed, as well. But I wrote these audio logs that you complete objectives to piece together. So I got to, in canon, an official, like, full moon produced game, put the lore together in an audio kind of, almost audio play kind of format.
Very
that was very, very fun. And so that game is on Steam. It's free to play. It just added the demonic toys this week so that people can bring Puppet Master versus demonic toys to life in a way Full Moon could never, ever afford to do in a movie.
Mm-hmm.
So that has just dropped, and I'm really proud of what I contributed to that game and really proud of what they accomplished making it. And I just had a book drop a couple weeks ago that I put out on my own called A Julie Carol, which is a slasher series of novellas that it's on Amazon, or people can buy it directly from me because it's Amazon.
Can you send me the link so folks can get it directly from you, and we'll put that in the show notes?
It's more just, it's been very informal. It's more of just DMing me on Twitter.
Okay.
For a copy. But yeah, the Puppet Master game, that's all the stuff that I've had coming up or coming out. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, everything at Nat Brehmar.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on. And I think we have you for another Frankenstein episode as well.
Yes.
I believe we do. I think we'll nail down which one, and we need to reach out more this year. I need to reach out more because it is always a pleasure having you on our show, and it's been way too long, and I apologize for that because we love having you on.
Thank you. I'm always happy to be here.
And Jessica, speaking of loving to have a person on, love having you back in that co-host chair. Looking forward to more of that in 2024.
Yes.
And I know you're looking to get back into film criticism and writing in a big way in 2024. So where can folks find your stuff? And is there any news that you want to break? Anything you want to discuss?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, everywhere as We Who Walk Here. My website, wewhowalkhere.com, has links to all my writing. I'm working on contributing some essays and possibly a book coming up. But mostly I'm just after a little bit of a hiatus due to some personal and some family issues last year, getting back into, film writing and podcast appearances. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter at We Who Walk Here and my website, wewhowalkhere.com.
Excellent. Brian?
I don't
always busy.
Yeah,
always a busy man.
I don't really have much more to add from the previous episodes right now, so I'll just say, you can follow me on any socials you so desire to follow me on at BrianWaves42, and just those Manor Vellum articles on Frankenstein. That's sort of the project. So
excellent. And movies, you can find the Movies for Life podcast everywhere you get your podcasts.
Yeah, and we're on Twitter and Instagram at Movie Life Pod if you want to follow us there.
All right. As for us, please make sure you are taking a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening on Apple, if you're listening on Spotify, hit that 5-star rating button. Again, 5-star review and a few kind words over an Apple. It goes a long way to new listeners finding us, and it's a free way to support the show, which we really appreciate. Another way to support the show is by literally supporting the show by giving us your money. So you can consider becoming a patron today by going to patreon.com/pod and the pendulum, where we have bonus episodes, bonus content up there. I think this month we're trying to get an Iron Claw episode up. I want to talk about that movie. And we don't always talk just horror movies because we contain multitudes, people. Don't put us in a box. All right. I got vaguely aggressive there. I'm asking you for money and being aggressive. Should not be doing that. Note to self. But again, patreon.com/pod and the pendulum if you would like to support us for a couple bucks a month. Follow us at Twitter at Pod and Pendulum, Instagram at Pod and the Pendulum, Blueski at Pod of the Pendulum. Follow me over at Letterboxd at Mike Chump Change. We'll be back next week with more Frankenstein. And I'm going to be honest, the next movie we're going to cover is the nadir of the franchise, I think. It is the shortest movie of all of them. It feels like the longest one. When we talk about Ghost of Frankenstein, Lon Chaney Jr. steps into the shoes of the monster. Lugosi comes back as Ygor. Lionel Atwill is back as well. What a picture. What a time. We'll be back next week. Ghost of Frankenstein. And it'll be the midway point in the Frankenstein journey. So see y'all next week. Take care, everybody.